Hey everyone, thank you very much. And yeah, you survived to the end of the first day at SREcon. So just one more to go, and then we're going to have some party outside. But I promise you that the last session will be fun enough to get a good ending for the day. And let's start with news that we're probably all aware of. We all got this lovely surprise in the middle of our summer breaks back in August. Who got paged or notified by this one, by work? Yeah, okay, I expected actually more hands. But so the news, HashiCorp announced changing the license of Terraform from open source to non-open source business source license. And as you probably all know, Terraform is today the de facto standard, maybe even language for describing infrastructure as code. It's got massive adoption and user base out there. There are thousands of Terraform providers developed by the community. There's modules, utilities, so you could only imagine. And by the way, this was not limited just to Terraform. Also the other projects, famous projects by HashiCorp, you see the names here, Vault, Consul, Packer, and so on. So big news. Since then, the community responded with a fork called, very sweetly, OpenTofu. That's a separate story how they reached out with this name. Catch me afterwards. It's led by vendors in the Terraform ecosystem. And since then, OpenTofu has joined the Linux Foundation. So today it's a foundational open source. And a couple of months ago, it actually reached its first GA, generally available release. So lots of milestones there. I'm not going to be delving into the Terraform relicensing story on this talk, but if you are curious to learn more, do check out this QR code. This is a special episode I did on my show, Open Observability Talks, with one of the founding members of OpenTofu. Lots of updates on how we reached that point, what's the roadmap, and where it stands. Cool stuff. My company, and in my company, we've experienced this sort of a cycle actually a few times in the past couple of years alone. These have been painful and an insightful experience. And today, I'd like to share some of these insights with you and look into these cases of when your open source turns to the dark side. My name is Dotan Horovits. I'm the principal developer advocate at logs.io. Logs.io provides a cloud-native observability platform that's based on popular open source tools such as Prometheus, Jaeger, OpenSearch, and others. I'm not going to be talking about Logs.io portfolio here, but if you are interested, do check us out. We have a booth downstairs, so come visit and get some nice raffle there. I'm also, as mentioned, a CNCF ambassador. CNCF is in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the open source foundation under which Kubernetes resides, as well as Prometheus, Jaeger, and many other projects that you probably use. And I have the podcast, as I mentioned, Open Observability Talks. So if you're here, it's probably going to be relevant for you about open source DevOps, SRE, platform engineering, and so on. Check it out on your favorite podcast app. And you can find me everywhere at Horovits. So if you have anything interesting that you're going to be posting out of this talk or want to reach out afterwards, feel free to tag me. So let's start with the experience we've gone through 3 years ago. It was beginning of 2021, second week of January, as everyone's getting back from the New Year vacations, kickstarting the new year. And then a bomb dropped on us. January 2021, Elastic NV announced relicensing Elasticsearch and Kibana from Apache 2.0 open source license to the non-open source dual license, SSPL, and the proprietary Elastic license. And that was due to take place starting the upcoming minor version. So the latest was 7.10, starting 7.11, that was going to be taking effect just less than a month from the announcement. Now, I assume everyone is familiar with the Elk stack. With a show of hands, who's familiar with the Elk stack? Okay, we have most of the audience, so you probably know a very, very popular stack for search, and in our context, the log analytics piece. It's been around for over a decade, and it's based on Apache Lucene. And the important thing is that for us, Elasticsearch database is at the core of our system. And we've been investing, as in many other users, for years in tweaking and optimizing it for our use cases. This is a critical system for us. So you could only imagine what confusion this notice caused us. But the thing is that the confusion was even greater, because the title of this notification was doubling down on open. And the notification itself talked about, and I'm quoting here, this license change ensures our community and customers have free and open access to use, modify, redistribute, and collaborate on the code. So free and open, as in free and open source license, FOSS, doubling down on open. Perhaps it's not such bad news. Perhaps SSPL is open source. These are the sorts of dilemmas and confusion that we experienced back then, and along with all the other community members, we saw that on the forums and so on. And the confusion was such that the OSI, the Open Source Initiative, this is the authority for authorizing or approving open source licenses, also the one that manages the open source definition itself, released a special clarification, as you can see here, clarifying that SSPL is not open source. It does not comply with the open source definition because it discriminates against specific fields of endeavor, and describing it as a FOXPEN source license. And that's very important. I see this confusion time and time again. Open source, or source available, as it's popularly called, source available is not open source. It's a FOXPEN source license. Not just SSPL, all the source available licenses. So you could imagine the confusion and the turmoil in the community. We saw raging posts like here, doubling down on open, not open at all. All sorts of articles, Elasticsearch and Kibana are now business risks, promises open, delivers proprietary, even angry bunny rabbits, as severe as it may be. And shortly after, people started calling to fork Elasticsearch and Kibana to keep them open. Our co-founder and CEO came out very early, a few days after already, with this blog post, and a much bigger player, AWS, stepped up and said it'll put engineers to drive this forward. And this discourse on the community was very clear. Community clearly said that it would prefer such a fork over Elastic SSPL, and it will switch to using it as soon as it's available. So what ended up with that? What did we do? We'll get back to that later. So what is open source software, OSS, anyway? We all know open source licenses, Apache, MIT, BSD, and I'm not going into the licensing. There are plenty of talks and material out there. That's not this talk. The question is having open source license enough to qualify an open source project? What prevents the project from changing license, just like we saw now? And who can change the license? So first takeaway for you, open source is more than a license. Okay? The OSI, the Open Source Initiative, had, at least on the old website, it had this slogan, I don't know if you can see on the lower part, guaranteeing the hour in source. And I love this quote, and piggybacking on this one, ask yourselves, who is the hour in source? Who governs the open source? And essentially, we can group them into three categories. The first one is open source run by individuals free maintainers doing it on their own time. That's actually the vast majority of the project out there on GitHub, okay? And just to name a few high-profile ones, curl that you can see here, used by millions of devices from your washing machine to your car, is maintained by a single maintainer to a large extent. And of course, Log4j, we all remember the fun around Log4Shell, the vulnerability, the CV that got showed us all the extent of usage of Log4j2, and it was run by 2 maintainers. Okay, so that's the vast majority of projects out there. The second category is open source governed by and owned by vendors. You saw the example of Elasticsearch and Kibana. We can talk about Grafana. We can talk about MongoDB. Of course, Terraform and Consul and all the HashiCorp suite. This is the second category. And the third category is open source governed by foundations, foundational open source. We have the Linux Foundation, the CNCF that I mentioned, the CDF, Continuous Delivery Foundation, Apache Foundation, Eclipse Foundation. These are vendor-neutral open source foundations. Usually you have multi-vendor environment around the projects, maybe different from the previous categories. So these are the who can govern the open source. And why is that important? You'll soon find out. And now let's look at some case studies of open source turning to the dark side. And first, I'd like to go to open source going non-open source. And for that, let's go back to the story, the case study of Elasticsearch. So we talked about Elastic's announcement, relicensing Elasticsearch and Kibana. And by the way, the reasoning was to fight off competitors, primarily AWS, that had commercial offering based on the open source without contributing back to the open source. At least that was what Elastic said. And, but the thing is that it didn't end up only with this relicensing. You know that inside the Elk stack, there's more than just Elasticsearch and Kibana. There's also Logstash and various other components and beats and the client libraries and so on. All of the rest of that remained Apache 2.0. But, and a big but, they start introducing breaking changes to enforce usage of these components with an official distro of Elasticsearch. For example, you have a FileBeat agent, which essentially reads logs off of the local file system and then ships them to the backend Elasticsearch cluster. So it was Apache 2.0, it stayed Apache 2.0, but now you had a check there that if the backend to which it sends it's not certified, it will break. As soon as you upgraded the FileBeat agent, things started to break. By the way, it started to break also for older versions of the open source. So if you had Elasticsearch version 7.10, for example, it would break there as well. The break happened in others, all the Beat shippers, the Logstash client libraries. It was pretty extensive. We started seeing things such as this post, people finding out that things are breaking and then looking into the code and seeing these snippets of if it's the version, else, and obviously not making people very happy. This is an equivalent. Imagine that the Oracle MySQL team had decided that the client libraries would connect only to official MySQL, obviously not working with MariaDB or Percona or things like that. That's the equivalent with SQL databases. And then, as I mentioned, the people talked about forking. Okay? The community reacted with a fork. The fork is called OpenSearch, led by AWS, alongside with Red Hat, SAP, Capital One, and Logs.io. Actually, I'm glad that my colleague here, Amitai, that is on the leadership committee of the OpenSearch project, is here with us, and he can tell you more about OpenSearch if you want afterwards. So you'd say, okay, open source. You just hit the fork button, and that's it. You have a fork, right? But it turned out that it's far from that. You can see here on the OpenSearch committee updates from the fork process, the developers realized very quickly that the Elasticsearch and Kibana code bases were entangled between the open source pieces and the proprietary elastic XPack code. So it was really entangled to the extent that in some cases they need to go line by line even to separate. So not really the fork it mentality. And also the team found also other things such as RSS feeds and pop-up messages, dial home, telemetry, all sorts of things that they needed to pull out. So it was quite a journey to reach there. If you want to read more about the journey, check out this episode I had with the community manager for OpenSearch at the time. He had a great storytelling about this journey that ended up after a year, back in July 2021, with the first generally available version. That was an amazing experience. And after that, it's been adopted by quite a few companies, including big names such as Dow Jones, Goldman Sachs, Pinterest, Rackspace, Zoom, and others. And of course, Amazon moved to using that, and also us at Logs.io. So that's Elasticsearch is the example of an open source moving to a non-OSI license, a Foxpen source license. But remember what I said before, that open source is more than a license, and definitely more than the OSI licensing scheme. In fact, things can also happen within the OSI licensing realm as well. Which brings me to the second case study, the case study of an open source going copyleft. That's the case study of Grafana in this case. And Grafana, I'm sure everyone knows Grafana, a very popular open source for metrics dashboarding and monitoring, Apache 2.0 licensed, owned by Grafana Labs. They also have Loki for logging, Tempo for tracing. And then at April 2021, we got this. Grafana Labs announced relicensing Grafana, Loki, and Tempo from Apache 2.0 to AGPL, GNU AGPL version 3. And Grafana explained it with a need to balance the open source with their monetization strategy. So essentially the same thing, competitors using the open source without giving back, as far as they say. Now, AGPL version 3 is an OSI compliant license that meets all the open source definition criteria. So I would say, well, what's the problem with that, right? And the problem is that the users that already use these tools woke up this morning to a new reality. They found out that essentially their system or the tool that they use is suddenly, how should I put it, infectious, okay, copyleft. And what does it mean? I'll give you an example before explaining. This is the open source policy by Google for using open source by its engineering, and it bans AGPL entirely as part of the policy, explaining, you can see that in the last line, that the risks heavily outweigh the benefits. And that's the case to many other vendors. So what is copyleft license anyway? And without going too deep into the legal talk, I'm not a lawyer, by the way, so definitely don't take my consultancy on that. But essentially, using AGPL software with modifications requires that anything it links to must also be made available under the same license, AGPL. And that's what makes it spread virally. So if you modify AGPL code, you're essentially at risk of license contamination. And in fact, even dynamically linking, by the way, I've seen discussions about that, may put you at risk. It's been never put to trial, so there's no ruling on that, but that's definitely a discussion as well. And another very interesting thing with AGPL version 3 is that it takes effect if your users even interact with it through a computer network, in the legal term, or just the internet. Okay? So you don't even need to package and send any product to it. So going back to Google or any other SaaS in which the users interact with your product via the internet, it essentially makes AGPL a business risk. And this is not just an issue for vendors, but also for the open source community. And this is what drove, following the relicensing, the CNCF to issue a very clear guidance to all the open source projects under the CNCF to either switch to alternatives or freeze the version and not upgrade to the relicensed version. Okay? Why? Again, imagine that you are an Apache 2.0 project. That's what you want to be. You don't want another license, AGPL or other, being imposed on you. So far, we saw the examples of Elastic NV and Grafana Labs. But it can happen not just with vendors, which is why I brought the third case study, a case study of two very popular NPM packages, Colors and Faker, both of which MIT license. I'm sure that you'll all agree, a very permissive license. And both maintained by Marek Squares, a single maintainer, doing it on his own free time. And then on January 5th, 2022, Marek Squares released a new version of the open source. Essentially, he deleted the source code for Faker and released it as an empty package to NPM, denoting it as version 666, 6.6.6, so a very ominous number, unless you use automation and you don't get anyone to see that. And then, you see the magician's hat logo? Poof, disappeared. Now, Faker received like 2 million weekly downloads and was also quite popular as a dependency on many JavaScript and Node.js projects. So you could only imagine what happened to users who automatically upgraded to the latest update. That's its release. In his defense, Marek gave a heads up a couple of months before in this GitHub issue that he opened. As you can see, no more free work for me. I'm no longer going to support Fortune 500s, pay it or fork it. So there were some signs. So it didn't end with Faker. 3 days later, on January 8th, Marek published a new version of Colors, the other package, with an offending commit that adds an infinite loop, essentially creating a denial of service to any Node.js server running it. And Colors NPM package was even far more popular. It had like 20 million downloads a week. It was used like with millions more other projects on GitHub. And the release, obviously, as you could imagine, immediately created the ripple effect of breaking numerous popular projects, including, by the way, AWS CDK, the cloud development kit, until NPM rolled back the rogue release. And you're asking why he did that. I think he answered it very clearly in this blog post titled, Monetizing Open Source is Problematic. So we saw case studies of open source going non-open source going copyleft, open source going rogue. And we've seen cases even in the past year, as we mentioned, and there are other patterns that you can talk about, like changing of terms of service, like happened with Terraform registry and other things. But what can we learn from these cases? So I'd like to share some learnings for building open source, for selecting open source, and for using open source wisely. And let's start with building open source. If you're building open source, maintaining, or considering, if there's one thing to take out of my talk, take this. Open source is not a business model. Okay? The problem is not with the commercial vendors, it's with the commercial incentive. So if you are a vendor, and if you choose the open source path, make sure that you build sustainable business model. Otherwise, you'll find yourself in this conflict between the open source and your business needs, and you'll end up relicensing defensively. And, of course, not to mention ripping off the community members that contributed from their time and effort to the source code. And if you're an individual maintainer, and if you decide to open source a project, do not expect material compensation. Yes, even if all the Fortune 500s use your project, don't expect it. There are plenty of ways out there to get paid for developing software. There's even options to get paid for open source activity. There are companies that pay open source maintainers. But this is not the way. Okay? Remember that. Or alternatively, of course, you can always go down the vendor path and build out a vendor entity around your open source, like Confluent did for Kafka. And if you choose that, of course, go back to my advice for vendors. So that's about building open source. Now, let's talk about using open source wisely. And a few tips there. First, manage your third-party licensing exposure, just like you do with security exposures. So obviously prefer the least restrictive licenses that are available amongst your selection. Look for license contamination, like Apache 2 that contains AGPL, and make sure that you have coverage. By the way, SBOMs, for those who are familiar, lots of talks in the past year or so about SBOMs, is a fabulous tool actually to do this tracking and to make sure that you're on top of it. Next, take care with automation. Imagine what happened to those who automatically upgraded from version 7.10 to 7.11 of Elasticsearch, okay? So take care with automation, put license compliance checks before updating third-party versions. Beware of these auto-updates without guardrails in your CI/CD pipelines. Also, look for code smells in the open source. They can actually tell you about upcoming relicensing or at least tension there. So again, it can buy you some time to act proactively rather than reactively. And when I talk about code smells, remember what I talked about when we talked about OpenSearch and Kibana, all sorts of mixture of code licenses, telemetry, dial home, all of these, or even when you're blocked from contributing as an external maintainer, all sorts of these signals. And I know it requires some familiarity with the code, but many of us, let's be frank, go into the source code to understand how the flows work and to optimize and things like that. So when you go in, keep your nose open for some code smells there. And if you find yourselves needing to tweak the open source to suit your needs, the preferred way should be via plugins over downstream modifications. That's much harder to block in terms of licensing and a much more canonical way to work. So remember that as well. So that's about using open source. And now let's talk about selecting new open source. So in the junction point of evaluating, you have lots of criteria that you're probably already evaluating. I want to add a few more that are maybe less top of mind. First, and that's a clear one, which open source license? And remember, not all OSI licenses are born equal. For example, we gave the example of copyleft. So make sure that you really understand the license and the fit to your need. And also remember, source available is not open source, okay? It's a Foxpen source license. Then ask yourselves who's behind the open source. Preferably, obviously not a one-man show. That's a single point of failure. Is it a vendor behind it, a single vendor owning the entire thing? Again, it can pull the rights ratchet on you. Think about this. Try to understand the risk there. I would say, and I know I'm biased, I'm a CNCF ambassador, but I would suggest to prefer foundational open source. It's not foolproof. We've seen also things happening with foundational open source, but having an entity that is vendor neutral, that brings together multiple vendors, it's actually part of the graduation process maturation process within the foundations to check that you have a balanced mix of vendors and end users and maintainers and so on helps, and there's a very clear governance policy, very important. And talking about governance policy, again, check what's the governance policy behind the project. How do they ensure no single entity grabs control? Who can get promoted and what's the path for getting promoted to contributor, to maintainer? Who can review, who can approve PRs? Who can ultimately decide on relicensing? And if the exposure to licensing changes is great in your organization, if you're sensitive to that, consider vendor distros or SaaS of the open source to shield you from these risks. So a distro is essentially a packaging of the upstream project run by a company, so they do it for you, and essentially what it gives you is indemnification, so effectively a license insurance against these things, alongside with, of course, getting hardware compliance to different hardware specs and support and other things. That's for on-prem, that you run it on the hardware yourself. If you prefer the cloud path, then you have SaaS versions that offer the open source as a managed version. This could be a path to mitigate the risks if you are concerned about this exposure. So let's summarize what we've seen so far. Open source is more than a license. That part I'm sure that you already are bought into. And open source can turn to the dark side in many ways. It can be relicensed, it can go rogue, it can otherwise pull the rug from underneath your feet. As we said, it's not just relicensing. We've seen examples of offending commits. It can change terms of service. It could go different paths. And it can happen to veteran projects. The fact that you say, hey, but this project has been around for a decade, no, it doesn't guarantee anything. Okay? It can happen anytime. We saw HashiCorp just less than half a year ago. So beware of this bait and switch stunt. It's concerning to see the rights ratchet model spreading. I wrote a whole blog post about that a while back already, a couple of years ago. Is vendor-owned open source an oxymoron? You have the QR code here. It's become more relevant these days, but it was written a good few years ago. And the tips that we talked about. Select open source wisely. We talked about asking yourselves which license, who's behind the project, what's the governance policy behind that, remember that. We also talked about using open source wisely. We talked about managing the licensing exposure. We talked about not to auto-update without safeguards. We talked about code smells, all these tips when you run the open source. And for building open source, as we mentioned, remember that open source is not a business model. So make sure that you clearly understand how you monetize without jeopardizing the community side and the open source side of the equation. And I'm leaving you with this. Always ask yourselves, who's the hour in source for the open source that you choose to use? So I'm Dotan Horovits. Thank you very much for listening, and may the open source be with you.